In June 1952, a man went on BBC radio and said something that should not have been possible. The script found on Crete, the one nobody had been able to read for half a century, was Greek. He was not a linguist. He was not an archaeologist. He was a working architect who designed school buildings for the British government, and the most respected authority in the entire field had spent his life insisting the one thing that could not possibly be true was that the script was Greek. He was so certain and so powerful that a Cambridge archaeologist who disagreed with him was effectively frozen out, unable to get a permit to dig in Greece. The story starts in 933 when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos on Crete. In the first season alone, more than 1,000 clay tablets came out of the ground. Eventually, the total passed 4,500. Their surfaces were packed with tight, unfamiliar signs. It was obviously writing. It was obviously administrative, palace record-keeping of some kind, and nobody on Earth could read a word of it. Scholars gave the script a name that admitted how little they knew, Linear B. Here's the first surprise. When the tablets were finally read, they contained no prophecies, no epic poetry, no royal proclamations. They were inventories. How many sheep, how many goats, how many chariot wheels were left in storage, how much coriander was in the spice stores. 3,000 years ago, palace bureaucrats wrote down the stock count, and that is what survived, because a fire that destroyed the palace baked the clay hard enough to last 3 millennia. The most tedious documents in the building were the only ones that outlived it, and those inventories would eventually prove the identity of an entire civilization. Arthur Evans worked on the script until he died in 1941, at the age of 90. He never cracked it, but he held one conviction with absolute force: it was not Greek. His reasoning had a certain logic to it. The Minoan civilization on Crete was older and more sophisticated than what he understood of the early Greeks. So its writing, he concluded, had to belong to some separate, unknown pre-Greek language. That position hardened into orthodoxy. And this is the part worth sitting with. When Alan Wace of Cambridge argued against him, Wace found himself unable to obtain excavation permits in Greece. A wrong idea held by the right man didn't just delay the answer, it silenced the people reaching for it. In 1936, a 14-year-old boy named Michael Ventris attended an exhibition in London and heard Evans lecture. 50 years and nobody has solved it. That sentence caught him and never let go. Ventris grew up to become an architect, but the script stayed with him. At 18, he published a paper on it in an academic journal, a teenager in a professional journal on the hardest unsolved problem in the field. And here's the detail people forget. In that paper, he argued the language was related to Etruscan. He was following Evans. The man who would eventually find the answer started out wrong, in exactly the same direction as everyone else. His adult life looked nothing like the life of a man about to rewrite Aegean history. When the Second World War came, he was conscripted into the RAF and flew as a navigator on bombers over Germany. During training, he taught himself Russian, more or less for fun. That was the kind of mind he had. After the war, he finished his architecture qualifications and took a job with the Ministry of Education, designing schools. An ordinary job, ordinary hours, and then he went home, and in the evenings at his desk, he kept working on the tablets. But the person who made the solution possible was someone else, and she has been left out of the story for most of a century. Alice Kober was a classics professor at Brooklyn College in New York. She worked on Linear B for decades, largely alone with no real research funding. She cut index cards by hand out of whatever paper she could find, including the backs of library checkout slips, and she made about 180,000 of them, tracking the statistics of every sign. And out of that grinding work, she found something. Certain groups of 3 signs kept appearing together, behaving like 3 variations of a single word. It's now called Kober's triplets. What it demonstrated was this: the endings of words were changing according to grammatical rules, the way an English child becomes children and childs. She had proved the language was inflected. She still had no idea what any of it meant, but she had established the skeleton. The answer would eventually hang on. Alice Kober died in 1950 at 43. She never saw it solved. In 1949, while Kober was still alive, Ventris did something a professional academic probably wouldn't have. He mailed a questionnaire to every serious scholar working on the problem, asking them plainly what they thought the language was. The replies came back, and the consensus held: not Greek. And Ventris agreed with them. He himself still rated Greek as unlikely. So at this point, the skeleton existed thanks to Kober, but nobody, including the man who would solve it, knew what to fill it with. On the 1st of June 1952, Ventris headed his 20th work note with a question: are the Knossos and Pylos tablets written in Greek? He was following up on something in Kober's data. Certain sign groups appeared overwhelmingly on tablets from one particular site and almost nowhere else. That pattern suggested place names, so he tried assigning the sounds of known Cretan place names like Knossos to those signs. Then he carried those sound values across to other words, and Greek words began to surface. Ordinary, recognizable ancient Greek words. He didn't believe it. He wrote afterwards that he went back and reworked the whole thing from the start, more than once, because the result seemed impossible. A script that half a century of scholarship had ruled could not be Greek turned out to be the oldest recorded form of Greek in existence. Ventris announced it that June on BBC Radio. The reaction was what you'd expect when an architect contradicts an entire discipline: polite disbelief. A young Cambridge linguist named John Chadwick happened to be listening, and later admitted his first reaction was that the claim was nonsense. Then he went and checked the evidence himself. Within days, he had completely reversed his position and written to Ventris offering to work with him. Together they assembled the case, publishing their joint paper in 1953. And then the confirmation arrived from a direction nobody controlled. Carl Blegen, excavating at Pylos on the Greek mainland, had a tablet that had been broken in two. When the pieces were rejoined and he read it using Ventris's values, the word written beside a picture of a three-legged cauldron came out as tripoda, tripodids, Greek for three-footed. The picture and the writing matched exactly. Nobody had arranged this. The tablet had been in the ground for 3,000 years and was read by a third party who had no stake in the argument. It was far too precise to be coincidence, and after that, serious doubt effectively disappeared. Michael Ventris had 4 years. In September 1956, he was killed in a car crash on a road north of London. He was 34. The book that presented his life's work, written with Chadwick, was published a few weeks after his death. He never held a finished copy. And this is bigger than one script being read. Once Linear B was confirmed as Greek, it proved that the people running the palaces at Mycenae and Knossos in the Bronze Age were Greeks, speaking Greek. Everything we've covered on this channel, the ruins at Troy, the gold-masked Schliemann pulled out of a shaft grave, the coastline of the Odyssey, all of it rests on that single confirmation. The Bronze Age Greeks were real, and we know because of a stock inventory of sheep and cauldrons read by a man who did it after work. Look at how this actually went. The most confident authority in the field was wrong, and his certainty cost a colleague his career. The person who built the foundation died before it was finished and is barely remembered. The person who found the final key wasn't a specialist at all, and the person who should have had decades to enjoy the discovery got 4 years. If there's a lesson buried in this, it might be that the truth was never sitting where the confidence was or where the authority was. It was in 180,000 hand-cut index cards and in a set of evening notebooks kept by a man with a day job. 3,000 years ago, a clerk in a palace on Crete pressed a stylus into wet clay and recorded how many sheep the kingdom owned. He had no reason to think that afternoon's paperwork mattered. He could not have known the palace would burn, that the fire would bake his tablet hard, that it would sit in the ground for 3,000 years, and that it would eventually consume the life of a boy in a London lecture hall, fill 180,000 index cards in Brooklyn, and finally give up its secret at an architect's desk after hours. History doesn't disappear, we just haven't finished listening yet. If you want to keep digging into the stories history left buried, subscribe to Witness to Time.